The talk I'm going to give today is based on my PhD research, which was called Caring for Space. And it was particularly concerned with the idea of care as a mode of activity, of ethical agency in spatial practice. So the work's really addressing particularly two of the panels today, both bodies and place. So today I'm just going to talk about three things. Firstly, I'm going to introduce the spatiality of care and interdependence, which is probably already very familiar to you as an issue, but it was a very important starting point for me in terms of acknowledging a kind of politics of location for myself. I'll introduce a little bit also ideas of commons. I won't go too much into it, but I particularly want to draw out aspects of visibility and value that Elke kind of raised before. And then I'll also finally conclude with some observations about different connections, and particularly aspects of transversality in kind of making new connections between us. So I'm going to start with the question, well, who is caring for who? And Rob mentioned earlier the different kind of crises we're facing, but the crisis which is perhaps a little bit less discussed is a crisis of care. And so a quote that I found particularly useful is by the political theorist Joan Tronto, and I'll just read it. She said, because the provision of care in human societies was almost always preceded by creating rigid hierarchies, castes, classes, by which some are able to demand the services of others, care has basically been of little interest to those in positions of power. The exclusion of care from politics grows out of an unwillingness to look at care on its own terms. Care is a complex process that ultimately reflects structures of power, economic order, and the separation of public and private life, and our notions of autonomy and equality. And so this question, who is caring for who, reveals hierarchies, dependencies, and exclusions, and in which some bodies are more valued than others, and also command the services of others. And when you make the question, who is caring for who central, you reveal geographies of dependence, which function with exploitation associated with this kind of labour. And as someone with an architectural background, although I'm not an architect myself, what was important in this question, who is caring for who, was that it's part of a spatial dynamics at multiple scales, from global, regional, to neighbourhoods, to our homes, to the scale of kind of microscopic organisms. So in my field, in architecture, we're quite used to thinking about issues of dependency in kind of material terms, be it carbon footprints, embedded energy, material life cycles, but we're much less used to confronting images like this. I'm afraid it's quite old, but it's from 2008, but I still feel that it makes an important point. And this map shows global maternal mortality rates. And at a similar time in 2009 in London, which is the city where I live, there was a study which showed that midwives in London are mostly trained elsewhere and they're imported like a commodity. And a very large percentage of London's midwives come from Ghana, which leaves Ghana, as you can see on the map, with very low numbers of midwives and a very high rate of both infant and mother mortality. So whilst, of course, this is an extremely complex situation and many factors are contributing to this, it is a result of our own economic model and lack of social sustainability, which is displaced to different and poorer regions. And so from an urban perspective, it was not necessarily this specific issue, which is of course a very real and big problem, but that I wanted to point to, but to point to broader questions of value within our economic lives and relations. Because of course care is not only carried out by midwives and nurses, but all who make our cities and regions livable, from teachers, cleaners, youth workers, community workers, those who grow our food and so on. So it's obviously quite an endless list. And feminists, particularly Maria Mies and Veronica Benholt-Thompson, sort of have shown very well how these relations of care and dependency are actually structured along spatial conceptions, and they point to in particular relations of city, country, urban, rural, work, home, public, private, and the so-called developing world, which is perhaps the scale represented by the map. And Leslie Kane Wiseman, an architect about 20 years ago, referred to what she called as a spatial caste system. And so this is an example that she gave, which represents the kind of cosmic order of a house in Timor. And she argued that the space was structured along dichotomies which were related to the body, front, back, upper, lower, and with, of course, the lower term in the dichotomy, of course, associated with the feminine, the reproductive, and the unvalued. So at different scales, from moss to the house to a global map, these concepts are present and function with exploitative divisions of labour, specifically care and reproduction. Of course, in life, the boundary between the two is, of course, never clear, particularly homework or public-private. And whilst they're not discrete in lived experience, geographers like Doreen Massey show very well that the way that they're deployed in discourse and policy as though they were, and she argues that these dichotomies belie their complexity and support perverse subsidies. Namely, they're quite a well-known local food campaign group. They're a kind of grassroots initiative in Todmorden, which is a small town in the northwest of England near Manchester. So it's a small town with around about 15,000 inhabitants. And their group's kind of overall kind of long-term ambition was for the town to be self-sufficient in producing its own food. And so the project has many layers of activities, including fruit, vegetable growing, beekeeping, orchard planting, medicinal herbs, aquaponics, chicken farming. They work with all the local schools, they hold events and classes and so on, how to keep chickens, how to sell eggs, pick wild plants and so on. So other areas of activities include developing future livelihoods and businesses, creating a study and learning centre, a fish farm, as well as kind of working farms. So they're extremely active. And so maybe there are important questions to ask about kind of localism and the kind of self-sufficient approach in relation to global concerns, how we care for what happens at the other end of the supply chain, for instance. So there's lots to discuss, but I just wanted today to focus on one small thing, which was concerning aspects of visibility and care. And what interested me in this case was the relationship of what is common, conventionally or traditionally understood as pertaining to a particular group or community, and what is public, specifically this edge condition between the two, because how you care beyond your group, let's say. And I think somehow this relationship between what's common and what's public is quite critical if we're talking about care and conditions of neoliberalism and austerity. At that time, I'm not sure if they still continue it, but they were doing lots of planting in public space, particularly vegetables, fruit planting, planting fruit trees, and the produce of all this planting was offered free to passers-by, so they were initiating a kind of gift economy in public space. And so through agreements, the group set up around about 40 plots, which were adopted by groups or individuals. And in these publicly accessible sites, they named these food to share. And I was quite interested in their emphasis on generosity in the public realm, and in particular their use of gifts to make connections between themselves and others. In interviews, I was interested in who is taking care of these plants in relation to who is looking after things and who is taking what. And some quite strong stories of reciprocity emerge. And so, of course, whilst these small plantings in public space are not commons, in the sense that no self-determined rules over the space kind of exists and there's no mechanism for direct democracy attached to it, I found that care as a form of labour had certain effects in mediating the relationships. And whilst this example is very small, it seemed to point to large concerns about the visibility of care as a form of labour. And one of the participants explained to me that from her perspective, she felt that sometimes the gifts are not gifts. She said that people don't really take what is there, even though it's marked as being free and you can take what you like. And she told me that the group had in some locations put up signs to explain, what the plants were, when you can harvest them. But actually, in most cases, things were not getting taken. And so it struck us that somehow the care that went into appropriating the space, planting, watering, weeding, protecting and growing the vegetables as a form of labour becomes read as a sign of ownership and negates the gift by marking it. It's likely that people have respect that went into growing the produce, which is increased by the way that the beds are marked. So when a bed was to be adopted, it was sometimes marked as showing who had responsibility and therefore who had made the gift. You're quite unlikely to take, broccoli that a disabled child grew, however freely it is offered. And similarly, they've also been very active in planting fruit trees across the town, and by 2011 they planted over 700 trees, along with edible plants like blackberries, blackcurrants, and so on. And in these contexts, the gifts also somehow appear more natural, and in many places the plants don't stand out. The trees and plants still need to be cared for, of course, but the care is less visible and looks natural. And so, whilst these were seen as some of the more successful aspects, it actually points to a difficulty of care being seen as a natural resource and activity, and one that continues then to remain unrecognised. And so yet at the same time, without marking, care has a tendency in Western eyes to disappear and remain unrecognised or seen as natural. This is also the case, of course, in other kinds of caring, maintenance and subsistence activities. In the Amazonian rainforest, for example, the Spanish conquistadors considered indigenous groups to be uncivilised because they were not seen to be practising agriculture, but in fact their agricultural practice were very sophisticated forms of relational forms of forest agriculture that today we would call permaculture. So their practices of agriculture went unseen and unrecognised because they did not look like European agriculture. But beyond gardening and agriculture, the point I kind of wanted to make was that relational practices in general, as ones which are embedded in their context, may also tend to disappear into that context, but trying to mark it or recognise its value risks appropriation as a form of property. So I'm interested in the contributions that spatial practice and visual culture might make, how aesthetic practices might help us move beyond this paradox and bring new habits, which also might include new ways of seeing and reading. And whilst Incredible Edible provide a shared resource, it's not, of course, a commons because there's no political community attached to it. But it does raise, does raise important questions about when we think about what constitutes such a political community. As Joan Tronte said, care, and particularly those caring, are usually excluded from politics. So how to include or connect to those who have different lives? So caring, some years ago, was defined by Nell Moddings as action on behalf of another. And such actions, she said, requires a motivational shift. And she suggests that this process begins with empathy. Empathy is not a projection or placing oneself in another's shoes, but she suggests begins with reception, and that care begins by feeling what another feels. And we need to allow ourselves to be transformed in this process. But if care begins with empathy, it's quite difficult in today's conditions. Berardi speaks about an energetic crisis, a diffusion of depression, citing that traces of Prozac had even been found in London's tap water, and which, of course, with depression one turns inward. You don't have the capacity for empathy. So this crisis of care, or care deficiency, which is both economic and global, is also in the body. And in feminist theory and politics, transversality has been quite an important way of working with both difference and equality, moving away from identity politics or assimilation approaches. And in the Italian kind of tradition, they emphasise rooting, a reflexive understanding of one's own situatedness, and a shifting, which aims to move towards another who are different from you. And it's a difficult process in which they acknowledge both the difficulties as well as the gains. It's also a psychoanalytic concept, which I'll return to in a moment. But in order to care, there is a need for mobility and displacement, that you have to move and to learn different standpoints. And if we speak about care in the field of art, this is perhaps one of the most famous work, UK's maintenance art projects. And whilst this is perhaps the most famous image, which is the artist alone working on the steps, one of the things I found more interesting, but that for some reason was less documented, or at least is less in the public domain, was the fact that, for instance, in her project, I Make Maintenance Art for 1 hour every day, she actually worked for a cleaning company for 2 months and cleaned the floors of a lower Manhattan office block alongside 300 janitors and cleaning women. Or Touch Sanitation, in which she shook hands with each of the 85,000 sanitation workers and shook their hands and said the words, "Thank you for keeping New York City alive." But less visibly than this, she also more significantly spent 8 hours a day with the workers every day for 11 months. And by joining the work of others to perform with her body the actions they performed, and to perform with them, is both a physical act, an epistemological one, but also an effective one. And I think this movement towards is quite essential, to recognise others, creating a situation in which to spend time and to do together. So So recognition is not only about acknowledging another's presence or contribution, but involves a kind of hospitality in a radical sense, which would be opening the self to the other. I think artists have a position which allows for this. It's in a certain aspect, it's maybe even a privilege of their role. And the panel this morning, in drawing attention to the body, reminds us of the importance of the ethical encounter, how we meet the other. This focus reminds us of very embodied practices, ways of listening, for instance, posturing, or an ethics that begins between the two. We're very much concerned with developing new habits of being. But how to think with this or work with this in more civic contexts without the loss of intimacy or meaning. So to come back briefly to the idea of transversality, it was perhaps more famously a psychoanalytic concept coined by Felix Guattari during his time at the Laborde Clinic. And working with an understanding that institutions contribute to the creation of certain kinds of subjectivity, he brought this notion to help us understand the otherwise closed logics that occur when structures and our practices become entrenched. And in the clinic, of course, in his context, the roles and relationships are highly structured, such as the doctor-patient relationship or the relation between medical staff and service staff. And so he developed a kind of intra-hospital committee in which all the staff, both medical and non-medical, along with the patients, participated. And together they undertook tasks that included not only medical work, but many other activities, such as cooking, cleaning, gardening, social activities, and so on. So this allowed people to work together on, say, a menial task, where normally they would be working together in a clinical situation with very established hierarchies, roles and procedures. It brought about as well new endeavours, new clubs, new activities. And Guattari speaks about the one example where they developed their own newspaper, and he remarks that one of the laundry workers, in fact, through this programme, became a very adept editor. And by bringing changes to institutional positions, the roles and relationships that had become sedimented in routines suddenly became open for redefinition by those who were participating. So I'm interested somehow not just in this concept of mobile positioning, but the possibility that you can transform your own position with and in relation to others and what you are capable of. And I think as someone who enables transversal connections, the artist Catherine Boehm does this, I think, in nearly all her projects. She's an artist and one of the founders of Public Works who have been developing a notion of common goods. So these are the objects which are produced in common, so they're products, but they also exist in a different kind of economy. So this is one of their most famous projects, Park Products, which is probably quite well known to you. But it's where they kind of explicitly developed this as a methodology. So they were invited to do a residency at the Serpentine Gallery. I'll just find that place. At the Serpentine Gallery in Kensington Gardens, in which they worked with a number of different user groups of the park to co-produce 12 products, of which this is one. And the project brought together product design students from the RCA, together with the different user groups. And this was the product that was produced with the gardeners. So the gardeners really wanted to work with a kind of compost, which is, so that's the gardeners, with the compost, which is collected in the leaf yard, and it's all the leaves from all the royal parks across London. And the leaves are collected in the leaf yard, which is very close to the Serpentine Gallery, but of course it's as a maintenance space, it's invisible to the public. So whilst it's an everyday space for the gardeners, it's not for the others. And so the group invented and designed the Chompost bar, which is like a chocolate bar, but made out of compost. And Public Works and the students made a mould, but the gardeners kind of pressed it with their digger. So there's a lot to say about this project, and this is just one of the examples of the products that they produced. But this particular product I found interesting because it symbolically altered the value associated with care. Chocolate is, of course, a kind of luxury product, but compost, even if it's royal, is still reproductive. And the process of its making also enabled changes in roles that people took in the group, moving from being a maintainer to being a producer. I think what's also interesting for me about the project was that they invented also a system of exchange and economy around the products. So they set up a market stall for trading the products. Every object had a different task or a currency attached to it. So if you wanted the Chompost bar, you had to go and find a gardener, offer your help for 5 or 10 minutes, and then whatever the gardener decides. And then when it's completed, they sign a note for you and you can go and claim the Chompost bar. So the conditions of exchange, rather than the use of the object, meant that you had to go into spaces that you would otherwise not go as a user of the park, to do something you would not normally do, to water plants, to help prune, to help tidy up, and importantly, speak to somebody who you would otherwise not normally speak to and see something of their world. In a seminar with us, Andreas Lang, the other founder of Public Works, commented that it was perhaps maybe not such great help for the gardeners, but I found it very interesting as a small example of the way an object and the process of its making can connect different people across different boundaries of use and ownership and so on. So the last example I'll speak about is a project that I've been involved in, which is called Economadic School, which is a networked local ecological pedagogy project. And it was initiated by these kind of 4 founders, AAA in Paris, Agency, where I'm a member in Sheffield, My Villages in Germany and the Netherlands, and the Foundation for Local and Community Development in Brăsoy, Romania. And each partner is kind of engaged with different populations in their own context, but they're all in some ways concerned with the loss of kind of ecological kind of life practices, for example, self-sufficiency, subsistence practices, alternative economies, crafts, more vernacular skills and knowledge. So in areas such as Brăsoy, these skills of course have been somewhat preserved. In another context, particularly the Parisian suburbs, vital skills and knowledge are held by immigrant populations who have no means or context to apply them. And the network was particularly concerned with such skills being the often feminised and unvalued ones that are no longer passed between generations. So the project aimed as a pedagogical project aimed to set up more mutual conditions for exchange and learning amongst the partners in their wider networks. So over the course of about a year and a half, the first stage of the project was in 2011 to 13. Each of the partners organised and hosted events for the others. Participants would be teachers or experts, yet in another you would participate as a student and the roles would be reversed. And so it demanded somehow repositioning yourself in relation to others, putting yourself in different roles and different contexts. And in some ways this goes further than mobile positioning or sharing of tasks, because you can not only learn about others' situations, but you come to learn how it is they know what they know, and then you also can learn the skills for yourself and increase your own capacity. And then because the invitation is extended in return, it's kind of mutual. So these are the practices that create different kinds of spaces and different ethical connections, which I think is interesting to think about, and how it can be extended to include others, non-human others, or others who are far away. And so to kind of conclude the talk, I'd just like to end with a quote, I think from Gibson Graham, who, because we are talking somehow this morning about the body, and that we are embodied subjects, which are obviously, of course, concerned with the kind of, I won't say small-scale relations, but the kind of ethical relations between us. But we're also concerned with bigger questions that face us. They write, if women are everywhere, a woman is always somewhere, and those places of women are transformed as women transform themselves. The vision of feminist politics, grounded in persons, yet therefore potentially ubiquitous, has been extended to include another ontological substrate, a vast set of disarticulated places, households, communities, ecosystems, workplaces, civic organisations, bodies, public arenas, urban spaces, diasporas, regions, government agencies and occupations, related analogically rather than organisationally, and connected through a web of signification. And they conclude by saying, feminist spatiality embraces not only a politics of ubiquity, its global manifestation, but a politics of place. So it's localisation in places created, strengthened, defended, augmented and transformed by women. And that admittedly stylised rendering, feminism is not about the category of woman or identity per se, but about subjects and places. It's a politics of becoming in place.